And for the rest, I think I shall begin in a few seconds. Let me just gather all the things I need. And for the rest, I think I shall begin in a few seconds. Let me just gather all the things I need. I think if I may request everyone to mute themselves if you are not speaking. I could hear somebody has my YouTube on with a delay. And I think Luna, maybe, yeah, thank you. Okay. All right, it's time to begin. So hello, everyone. Welcome to our Zoom panel on the Summit for Socialist Democracy. This event is jointly organized by Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group and is co-sponsored by the Morning Star, the International Action Center, Nodudol, and the Chiao Collective. My name is Radhika Desai, and I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group. As you know, this is our answer to the recently concluded Summit of the Democracies organized by President Biden. Just how hollow President Biden's big idea of organizing an alliance of democracies is should hit us when I make the following land acknowledgement, which has now become usual in Canada. I speak from Winnipeg. Winnipeg stands on Treaty 1 territory. Treaty 1 is the first of 11 numbered territories, and it was made in 1871 between the Crown and the Indigenous peoples of this part of Canada. Winnipeg, therefore, stands on the stolen lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Despite centuries of harm, ongoing dispossession, deprivation, our governments continue to fight these nations when they pursue their rights in their courts, spending millions on fighting them rather than actually giving them their rights. This underlines the fact that the wealth of the core countries that President Biden calls democracies is built on imperialism and settler colonialism. While so many countries they are pleased to call autocracies have done far more to defend the rights of indigenous peoples and minorities. So essentially what President Biden is doing is weaponizing a ramshackle democracy, and the result can only be an extremely dangerous but ineffective weapon. The fact of the matter is Western democracies are clearly failing. Even President Biden had to draw attention to that. Considering that even the shoddiest of goods look bright and shiny when they are first produced and launched, President Biden's big idea of an alliance of democracies is already looking worn and tired on the day of its launch. Even the normally congratulatory Western media has been calling it ill-conceived, misjudged, divisive, and they are wondering whether US democracy can take the weight President Biden is putting on it, whether it might backfire, whether it will provoke a counteroffensive, and above all, whether by referring to the global recession of democracy, President Biden is only worsening the situation. The simple fact is that Western democracies are in decline for one root reason. For the last 40 years and more, their neoliberal governments have been devoted to keeping in power an ever-narrowing elite of financiers and the owners of a few big corporations. No wonder the role of corruption, fraud, electoral manipulation by money, the media, and the social media are rife in Western democracies. And today, a wave of populism represents the spreading distrust of the established powers in Western democracies. However, even when first world democracies were supposedly at their peak, things were far from perfect. After all, Che Guevara said, we should not allow the word democracy to be utilized to represent the dictatorship of the exploiting classes. More systematically, Canadian Marxist philosopher Crawford McPherson exposed the same reality, the reality of class rule under the guise of democracy. All countries, he insisted, back in the 1970s, including communist countries and third world democracies, had rightful claim to be called democracies. And he pointed out that Western liberal capitalist democracies were only one sort of democracy. They were originally only liberal representative polities. They were not democracies. They were made into democracies only by the unrelenting struggles of working peoples, women, minorities of all sorts, and so on. So as a result of these struggles, eventually, reluctantly, kicking and screaming, these liberal orders became liberal democratic orders. But, and this is part of the genius of Macpherson, he pointed out that just as these liberal orders became democratic, they also did something else. They made democracies liberal. That is to say, they ringed democracy around with all sorts of constitutional and other limitations, preventing popular power of the people from infringing the rights and privileges of small elites to their property, to their power and their privilege. Even in the heyday of post-war Western liberal democracies, the CIA and its offshoots had to be mobilized to keep these societies capitalist. The irony is that the West has started weaponizing democracy as a weapon of its imperialism just when neoliberalism has been steadily undermining it for 4 decades. Today, it stands at a nadir. President Biden's attempt to renew its weaponization can only fail. Even the Financial Times has told us that, in fact, and Financial Times is no enemy of President Biden. It has identified 3 flaws of Biden's strategy: that it is vulnerable to allegations of American hypocrisy, because it still supports strongmen, authoritarian and really dictatorial regimes all around the world, that it could be self-defeating, in the sense that rather than leading by example, the Americans are pleading the case for a democracy they themselves do not have. And thirdly, that it could push the autocracies closer together. However, being what it is, the voice of the bourgeoisie of the West, it could not and did not identify a 4th danger, which is the far more real one, and which for people like us is the hope, which is that this will provoke China and other countries into a serious critique of capitalist liberal democracy and propose credible options, conceptions, institutions, and practices of democracy of their own. China is already doing this with a white paper on its whole process democracy and its ongoing attempts to realize its own ideals of socialist democracy. The letters of Ambassador Anatoly Antonov and Qin Gang, respectively of Russia and China in Washington, have already struck very close to home. So, how is this contest being conducted? How is it faring? This is what our guests are here to tell us. So we will begin now our Summit for Socialist Democracy. We are going to have speakers for about 2 hours. Each speaker should be confined to about 8 to 10 minutes, and I will introduce each speaker as they go along. At the end of the speeches, we will have time for questions and answers, so please stick around. You are welcome to use the chat to chat to each other, but please note that we cannot promise that the questions you put in the chat will be answered. So if you want your question answered, you want to make sure it's answered, please raise your hand after the formal presentations are over. So that is the basic housekeeping, and I will now introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Danny Haiphong. Danny is a socialist activist and journalist. He serves as contributing editor to Black Agenda Report and is co-founder of the No Cold War campaign and co-editor of the Friends of Socialist China website. He is also co-author of the book American Exceptionalism and American Innocence, A People's History of Fake News from the Revolutionary War to the War on Terror. So, Danny, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Radhika, and I really appreciate all of you who have come out to speak at this event and for everyone who's watching and attending here. So we are going to span the globe today to talk about socialist democracy and to talk about the comparisons of socialist democracy and capitalist democracy. And this comes after the United States, as Radhika mentioned, hosted a summit for democracy over the past 2 days, which was an obvious attempt to legitimize the unipolar and hegemonic claim of the United States over the so-called rules-based international order. While on the surface, this appeared to be an unproductive move on the part of the world hegemon, it really does align well with the US strategy of cloaking its aggressive and exploitative policies under the guise of democracy. Joe Biden's administration has repeatedly hyped the differences between quote unquote autocracy and US led democracy. So-called allies were summoned to give credibility to the US's vision of democracy on the international stage. And I watched the summit over the past 2 days, and I can tell you that it was an abject failure. But we at Friends of Socialist China saw this attempt by the Biden administration as an opportunity to discuss the distinctions between capitalist democracy and socialist democracy. And there's no higher form of capitalist democracy than in the United States. The United States has been the wealthiest capitalist country in the world since the end of World War II. And since then, US elites across the political spectrum have employed the word democracy as a key justification for its domestic and foreign policy. This has involved diligent avoidance of any scrutiny of the claim that capitalist democracy represents a universal system for all peoples and nations. Scrutiny, of course, runs the risk of exposing the class character of capitalist democracy, the most glaring contradiction of the system. Capitalist democracy is a democracy of, by, and for the rich and powerful owners and managers of capital. Democracy in such a context serves a minority of the population at the expense of the vast majority. As Vladimir Lenin put it in State and Revolution, quote, democracy for an insignificant minority, democracy for the rich. That is the democracy of capitalist society. And there's ample evidence of this contradiction in all spheres of US political and economic life. Nearly half of the United States cannot afford a $400 emergency as wages stagnate and jobs fail to meet the cost of living. About 500,000 people sleep on the streets or in homeless shelters at any given moment. The situation worsens when race is factored into the analysis. The median Black family has just $1,700 to its name. Meanwhile, capitalists such as Jeff Bezos have enjoyed record profits amid a global pandemic that has plunged the US into its second economic crisis in 13 years. While voting is held in the highest regard under capitalist democracy, none of the aforementioned material conditions were voted in by the people. Matters of policy are decided well before the exercise of voting is complete. Representatives elected to govern over capitalist democracy are almost entirely bound to the dictates of capital. In the United States, influential politicians such as President Joe Biden, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and Senator Kristen Sinema receive enormous donations from Wall Street financial institutions, weapons manufacturers, and for-profit health insurance and pharmaceutical corporations. As Lenin again surmised, the people essentially vote for whichever representative of the ruling class will oppress them every 2 to 4 years. Socialist democracy is different from capitalist democracy in both character and form. Socialist democracy doesn't privilege the political freedoms of the individual above all else. Rather, socialist democracies set out to secure the right to housing, healthcare, education, employment, and life itself as key priorities of governance. This makes historic sense. Socialist revolutions have occurred in the context of colonized and underdeveloped nations, thus making the development of the productive forces and the economic well-being of the people paramount to stability and survival within a hostile global situation. Existing socialist democracies include China, Vietnam, Cuba, the DPRK, and Laos, all of which emerged from the devastation of war and colonial domination in the 20th century. Socialist democracy is a model of substance. While different in form depending on the national and economic context of the society in question, socialist democracies have key features in common. These include the leadership of the Communist Party, a common history of struggle against foreign imperialism and colonialism, and the successful transfer of the means of production from the oppressor to the oppressed classes. Socialist democracy has allowed Cuba, for example, to ensure that more than 90% of its population own their own home and 100% have access to free, quality healthcare. It has also allowed Vietnam and Laos to survive the devastation wrought by destructive US wars and make significant headway in eliminating extreme poverty. and it's allowed the DPRK to defend itself from ongoing military provocations and sanctions enforced by the United States. Perhaps there's no better area of study than geopolitics to observe the superiority of socialist democracy for humanity. Capitalist democracies have histories riddled with centuries of colonial adventurism and imperialist war. From 1945 to 2011 alone, an estimated 20 to 30 million people have been killed around the world as the result of US military interventions. Capitalist democracies from the US to the United Kingdom continue to violate international law on a regular basis in order to satisfy their own selfish economic and political ends. Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and dozens of other countries find themselves mired in poverty and instability as a result of direct interference from so-called capitalist democracies. In other words, the United States and its so-called democratic allies engage in a wholly undemocratic framework of unipolarity in world affairs. Capitalist democracies routinely place their interests above those of humanity and use force to resolve disputes or satisfy political and economic agendas. On the other hand, socialist democracies adhere to international law and champion a multipolar orientation to global governance. None of the existing socialist democracies have waged a war of aggression in the modern era. In fact, all of them have been at the forefront of demonstrating the true benefits of international cooperation and solidarity. The examples are numerous. They include China and Cuba's joint ventures in biotechnology, which helped produce antivirals that provided immense help in China's early fight with COVID-19. China's Belt and Road Initiative must also be noted, since the massive infrastructure plan has already brought enormous benefits to underdeveloped countries around the world. The Sino-Laos high-speed rail line being just one recent breakthrough. The provision of nearly 2 billion COVID-19 vaccines from China to the world has offered hope to poor countries unable to access expensive vaccines produced by private Western manufacturers. In March 2021, socialist democracies led the way in forming the group of friends in defense of the UN Charter, a significant development in forging a future of world peace. In sum, Biden's Summit for Democracy was nothing more than a projection of the narrow form of democracy championed by the world's foremost imperialist hegemon. The Summit for Socialist Democracy here, however, emphasizes the promises and prospects of democratic governance models offered in the struggle for socialism. A greater understanding of the development trajectories of all peoples and nations around the world is of critical importance toward collectively resolving the pressing problems facing the human race in the 21st century and beyond. From this vantage point, socialist democracies set an example worthy of attention and defense from the incessant propaganda leveled against them by the declining Western world order led by the United States. And I look forward to everyone's speeches and talks here today and the question and answers, because this is exactly what we'll be getting at. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Danny. Our next speaker is Professor Chang Fu. Professor Chang is an academician at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, director of the Research Center for Economic and Social Development at CAS, and principal professor at the University of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He is also president of the World Association for Political Economy and president of the Chinese Society for Foreign Economic Theories, and a member of the National People's Congress of China. Professor Chang's speech will be delivered in English by Dr. Zershu Liu, and while showing you a video of Professor Chang's speech. So Zershu, please go ahead.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Because this computer kept remind me that the audio, the microphone is not working normally. Anyway, thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for all who are attending the meeting today. I will be presenting on behalf of Professor Chang, who as Rebecca introduced. And the title of the presentation is 4 Criteria of Democracy the superiority of China's full process socialist democracy over the democracy in the United States. To begin with, the key to a country's democracy is whether the people are the masters of their own country. To that end, four important criteria must be considered in determining whether a country's political system can be called democratic. First, the right to vote is important, but more important is people's wide participation. When people have the right to vote, they can freely express their personal will, but this is far from enough because the equality in the political right of one person, one vote does not necessarily remove other inequalities in economic and social terms. To solve this problem, people must have the right to participate in an all-round manner. The right participation is the kernel of democratic politics. A democracy in which people have only the right to vote but not the right for broad participation is only formalistic. Evidently, it is of equal importance to ensure and support the people's position as masters and to allow them to participate deeply in the management of both national and social life through elections in accordance with law, as well as through systems and means other than election. In China, people have long gained the right to vote to express their personal will. In addition, the people have, in accordance with the law, participated in the management of state affairs, economic and cultural undertakings, and social affairs through various ways and forms. In contrast, democracy in the United States is often characteristic of an opposition between the purpose and outcome of democracy, where electoral democracy is stressed while governance-oriented participatory democracy is disdained. The reason for this is that American electoral democracy is a tool to transform capital power into political power. It follows the logic of capital in essence. It is subjective to the erosion and the manipulation by money from various large consortia and interest groups, so that the political direction of the successful candidate in election is swayed by money and small groups' interest, and it is difficult to represent the will and interests of the broadest mass of people. Therefore, the United States only has the formal democracy with the right to vote, but not the substantive democracy with the right for broad participation, which reveals that the democracy of electoral fetishism in the United States is only a partial democracy at its best. The second criteria, promises made in elections are important, but more important is how many of those promises are fulfilled after election. The end of democracy should not be those promises made during the elections, but turning verbal promises into real actions. No genuine democracy exists if the people are called on only at the time of voting and then go into dormancy afterwards, or if they are only allowed to listen to slogans during the election campaigns but have no say afterwards, or if they are favored only at the time of canvassing but are left out after the election. The ruling party and the government to consistently respond to the needs and demands of the people and turn verbal promises into effective action. The Communist Party of China and the Chinese government at various levels have a strong and continuous attention and responsiveness to the interests and needs of the people. This is due to the fact that democracy in China covers the 5 processes of democratic election, democratic consultation, democratic decision-making, democratic management, and democratic supervision. This forms a systematic whole process democracy, and this ensures that whatever is promised during the election will be realized after it. On the contrary, the United States is often a giant of words but dwarf in action with regards to election promises and their actual fulfillment. This is because the candidates do not really care about the demand of the general electorate, but only aim at getting more votes through the show. It is the money provider and interest groups that they truly care and pay back. The American people in the election process easily get a lot of verbal promises, but they are easily dismissed after the election to become bank check that can never be cashed, just like moving the water of flowers in the mirror, or will only be fulfilled in a limited and temporary manner. The third criteria, political procedures and rules are, as stipulated by law, are important. But more important is whether these procedures and rules are actually followed. In China, the political procedures and rules are strictly stipulated by law in its political system. For example, the procedures and forms of the election of the National People's Congress include initial inspection and consultation, preparatory election, anonymous ballot, and competitive election. There are both top-down nomination and bottom-up free election. It is a genuine procedural democracy. In addition, China's system and laws have the advantage of nationwide implementation under the principle of democratic centralization, with little interference from political lobbying and narrow interest groups. As a result, China's system and laws truly unify the expression of public opinion and the satisfaction of public needs, thus achieving a democratic system with strong implementation and high overall performance. In contrast, although the US system and laws also provide political procedures and rules, they are much weaker than those in China. The reason is that interest groups and major political parties, which are based on private ownership of the means of production, tend to weaken certain political procedures and rules intentionally or unintentionally through games or collusion. Moreover, the goals and results of the implementation of its systems and laws are very different, hence bills proposed by the president may be rejected by the Congress. Bills proposed by senators may be rejected by the House of Representatives, and bills proposed by Republicans may be rejected by the Democrats. Any one veto can lead to the delay of reasonable and a legitimate bill, or even the situation of discussion without decision and decision without action, as exemplified in the US government shutdown due to the fiscal crisis. A bill is unlikely to be truly implemented or successfully implemented in such a political environment that is often in white-hot competition and will often become a laughingstock as a rubber check. The fourth criteria, democratic rules and procedures for the operation of power are important, but more important is whether power is truly monitored and checked by the people. The people are the legitimate source of all power in the state. Power can only play its critical role if it is truly subject to strict supervision and control by the people on all fronts. After a long period of practice and improvement, China has institutionalized and standardized its rules and procedures for the operation of power, further enhanced the efficacy and anti-corruption orientation of power, while preventing the possibility of unconstrained and capital-controlled power. For example, a system has been established in which those in power dare not to be corrupt. Corrupted officials are severely punished, and bribery is combated. Transparency has been improved in party affairs, administrative affairs, and the judicial affairs. The system of questioning, accountability, economic responsibility audit, registration, and dismissal has been improved. At the same time, regulations have been implemented to ensure internal supervision within the party and the government, and supervision by the National People's Congress, democratic parties, people without party affiliation, scientists, and the masses, which creates an open and transparent environment for power operation. This multi-level system of supervision and regulation in China carries forward the fine tradition of the ruling party, the National People's Congresses, and the People's Government, namely close connection with the masses, self-criticism, and self-revolution. In contrast, the self-claimed rules and procedures for the operation of power in the United States contains the selfish class interests, party interests, and personal interests.
Zershu, I hope you will be wrapping up soon.
Yeah, I'll just have a minute.
Sure.
The personal interests of a very small number of people in power from various sectors of society. The function of such rules and procedures is to prevent this small group of people from internal fight, conflict, and friction. Therefore, it is very difficult to subject power in the United States to wide supervision and strong checks by the people. And to conclude, I believe that I just want to repeat what Radhika said in the beginning. At the center is the power of the people, and also what I presented in the beginning, where the peoples are the genuine masters of the country, is the number one criteria for any country to be called democratic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zershu, and sorry to have asked you to wrap up, but we do have a lot of other excellent speakers, but Professor Chang's remarks are always very welcome and enlightening. Our next speaker is Carlos Ron. Carlos, as many of you know, is Venezuela's Deputy Foreign Minister for North America and President of the Simon Bolivar Institute for Peace and Solidarity Among Peoples. So, Carlos, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Radhika, and thank you, Friends of Socialist China International Manifesto Group, for putting this together. Friends, I bring you greetings from what I'm proud to say is one of the most vibrant democracies in the whole world, the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Just a few weeks ago, we carried out our 29th election in 22 years of revolutionary democracy, a democracy that was constituted in 1999 with the approval of a new constitution that was drafted by popularly elected members for the first time and approved by popular vote for the first time. That is direct popular vote, no electoral colleges, no intermediaries, nothing of the sort. Under this constitution, Venezuela is a participatory democracy. That is a step further from this traditional bourgeois state that the United States believes it can apply or impose on the rest of the world. It is a democracy, Venezuela is a democracy where the paramount decisions are consulted with the electorate, where any elected official from city council to president can be recalled by the middle of his or her term if the electorate so decides. A democracy where organized communities can directly participate in drafting and promoting legislation. And as an example, the Venezuelan seed law is a law that prohibits the use of GMO seeds. It was drafted, proposed, composed, and presented by organized communities. So most importantly, Venezuela became a society where democratic participation became so meaningful that participation in elections increased even after voting stopped. After voting stops being mandatory by law. We achieved this by bringing politics to everyday life, by bringing politics to community organizing, and by making politics the source of concrete changes and policies affecting people's everyday life. That is why our democracy is no longer just a concept limited to election cycles, but more of a common day, everyday event. Perhaps the greatest achievement of Venezuela's democracy was engaging all of the population so that regardless of your political ideology or sympathies, everyone participates and relates to the democratic experience. That is why Venezuelan democracy doesn't fit the neoliberal model. Venezuelan democracy is not a Norman. It's not there to support a status quo or passively stand by while corporations make decisions over our lives. Venezuelan democracy, which is building a new model for the state where the communes will be at the center, where the priority is the guarantee of human rights, understood not only as political rights, but social, economic, cultural rights as well, the right to dignified housing, to healthcare, to education, as well as collective rights to enjoy the country's resources, and even the right to protect the planet. That is why Venezuelan democracy doesn't fit that Washington pattern. Venezuelan democracy is not there to cater to corporate needs or US foreign policy objectives. Venezuela, the Venezuelan democracy also knows that Venezuela has responsibilities within the international community. Venezuela respects international law and works every day in achieving what Simón Bolívar called the equilibrium of the universe, a balance where no one country or group of countries can impose their will over others, where cooperation is not only preferred, but actually sought. What Washington wants in Venezuela is a democracy where decisions are made at the level where the US can get control of the decision makers, where Washington can interfere if protests arise, like in Colombia, and repress people that are coming out to the streets and protesting for their rights. Washington wants a democracy where court independence exists only to the extent that it prevents progressive movements from crossing the lines or from demanding too much, or where if anyone gets out of line, well, there are ways to persecute them through lawfare. And of course, we saw the greatest example of this yesterday on the International Human Rights Day, when you have a group of countries, sitting around virtually and speaking of what they believe democracy should be, while they approve Julian Assange's extradition to the United States, so that his human rights are going to be now in jeopardy and his life is going to be in danger. That is why for the last 3 years, Washington has attempted to impose its own version of democracy in Venezuela by violating international law, exerting pressure through illegal unilateral coercive measures, and by recognizing a self-proclaimed interim president whose only achievement has been to allow Venezuela's assets to be frozen in foreign banks or stolen in detriment of the rights and well-being of all Venezuelan people. That is why that imposter participated yesterday in Biden's summit, an imposter who readily aligned himself with US foreign policy, who accepts US authority to split the world into democracies, into the democratic and authoritarian categories, into good and bad, as they want us to think. That's why Venezuela cannot sit at that table, and neither could Cuba or Nicaragua or China or Vietnam or any country that has any type of independent foreign policy. Venezuela, and I say coming to an end, my friends, Venezuela is building socialism, and building socialism is a struggle. We have people committed to social justice, but we're building a more just system under the most unjust conditions, where we are not only blockaded, we're constantly under threat and being persecuted. So our model, therefore, needs to adjust to our realities and to our characteristics. That is why no two socialist models or no two democratic models are the same, nor should they be. What they must undeniably do, though, is guarantee a better and dignified life to a large majority of the populations. Venezuela is respectful of international law, of the most democratic of all summits or gatherings that we have now, which is the United Nations. And we believe, that's what we defend the Charter of the United Nations, we defend its principles, and we believe that that's something that we must continuously aim to defend and protect. So coming from Venezuela, from the Simón Bolívar Institute, we believe that peace and solidarity can only truly exist under socialism, and that it is up to our socialist democracies to resist imperialist aggression and uphold them. Thank you very much.
Well said, Carlos. Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much. Our next speaker is Luna Nguyen. She's a Vietnamese Marxist-Leninist popular educator and vlogger. Her videos on her Luna Oi YouTube channel explain the nature of Vietnamese socialism and explore Vietnam's history. Her work has received hundreds of thousands of views, confirming her status as one of the most effective communicators of Vietnamese Marxism in the English language. She's currently working on an English translation of the official Vietnamese curriculum on Marxist theory, which should be absolutely fascinating. Luna, what a fantastic idea. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Luna. I'm a Vietnamese communist born and living in Vietnam. I have a YouTube channel named Luna Ơi, where I talk about a variety of topics about Vietnam. And it is my honor to have a chance to speak in our very important event today. As a Vietnamese born and living in Vietnam, my whole life I've been like hearing Western media spreading distortions and misinformation about Vietnam, about how authoritarian we are and how we don't have a democracy. The lies about Vietnam are often absurd and even laughable, but unfortunately they influence millions of people around the world, especially people living in the bourgeois democracy. The people who pushing these lies are pretty good at what they do, actually. They know their audiences, and they know what most people in the imperial core are predisposed to believe in the imperialist lies. And they know how to spark outrage and sow distrust in socialism among the working people of the developed West. I've made many videos on my channel in which I've talked about Vietnam socialism, our elections, our land reforms, and our labor unions. In producing these videos, I have learned a lot about my country. And in interacting with converts from all around the world, I've come to see just how different Vietnam's political system is from the most of the rest of the world. And the more I learn, the more I realize how lucky I am to have been born in Vietnam. So that I am here to say that despite the imperialist lies you've no doubt heard, Vietnam does have a strong system of socialist democracy. One of the most common attacks leveled against Vietnamese democracy is that we only have one leading political party, the Communist Party of Vietnam. So therefore, we are a dictatorship and authoritarian. The fact is that, like, as I made very clear in my "How do elections work" in that video, you do not need to be a party member to run for office in Vietnam. In fact, we have many national representatives who are not party member. Vietnam actually has 5 times more independent members of our National Assembly than the House and the Senate of the USA. That said, it is true that the overwhelming majority of our National Assembly are members of the Communist Party of Vietnam. And why might that be? Well, this might be a shock for some of you, but a lot of communists win elections in Vietnam because a lot of Vietnamese people are communists. In the Asia Barometer survey, an independent poll conducted in 2 separate years in the University of Taiwan, 85% of Vietnamese people approved the government in Vietnam. That's the highest consistent approval rating on any country in Asia. We also have a much different idea about what democracy means in Vietnam than most other Asian countries, with the majority of Vietnamese defining democracy as social equity. So yeah, we vote communist because we are communists. And why should that come as a surprise? For a century now, generations of Vietnamese people have made a huge sacrifice to build socialism in Vietnam. We had a successful revolution. We fought and won many wars with the most powerful countries on earth to have our own self-determination. A lot of foreign propagandists want to make you think that our revolution was similarly rooted in nationalism and not communism. They want you to think that soldiers like my grandpa, who died in Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War, were not really communists, and they didn't really care about communism. And they want you to think that we don't really care about building socialism today. I am here to tell you that that's all wrong. We know exactly what we're doing and where we want to go. We are not a nation of victims and oppressed people who are yearning for capitalism. Nah. We are, by and large, committed socialists, and we believe in the Communist Party because it has materially improved our lives for decades now. And one more thing, seriously, if we are really oppressed, we're going to be the first ones to free ourselves. We beat the Japanese fascists. We beat the French colonialists. We beat the USA imperialists. If you really think that we really feel oppressed by our own government, we couldn't overthrow it, just look at our history and you will have your answer. Now let's compare our socialist democracy to capitalist bourgeois democracy that Western media outlets have been pushing on us for decades, such as the quote-unquote democracy in the USA. Theoretically, the United States has 2-party system with the Democrats and the Republicans. And this is somehow supposed to be superior to our system. Now let me quote Julius Nyerere, the first president of Tanzania. The US is a one-party state, but because of its typical American extravagance, they have two of them. So the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are just two different faces of one capitalist party. Every 4 years, they just take turns making a show of pretending to shift power around while the ruling class pulls the strings behind the scenes. No matter which party is in charge, the US still bombs other nations, still refuse to give millions of American workers a living wage, still refuse to give its people universal health care, and still put children in cages. No matter what party takes power in any given election, there's still ever increasing police brutality, more and more homeless people. And to cover their ugly nature, the US has been sugarcoating a situation with beautiful buzzwords such as freedom and democracy. But have you ever asked, what kind of freedom do you have? Freedom to die because of a preventable disease? Freedom to lose your jobs without any protection from a global pandemic? And freedom to be evicted because you couldn't afford your crappy, overpriced apartments owned by rich landlords. The only choice you have is an illusionary choice to vote red or blue. And both the DNC and the GOP exist to maintain the dominance of the bourgeois class. Countless studies have shown that bourgeois democracies such as the US, UK, and Canada, and France heavily prioritize the will of wealthy while dismissing the concerns of the working class. For all the reason of Vietnam for not having like independent voices in our National Assembly, how many times has a third party candidate actually won in Congress in the USA? And how much of a voice how much of a voice like do independent Congress representatives have even when they do win some seats? None whatsoever. Democracy under capitalism is an illusion. You have an illusion of choice, but in reality, you have no power whatsoever. Yes, in Vietnam, we have one leading party, but our Communist Party is a party of the people, built by the people and supported by the people. We fought tooth and nail to have our own Communist Party. To us, for now, it is the safest way to protect ourselves in this capitalist hellhole, where the imperial court constantly wants us to die off for imperialist profits. Lots of leftists criticize us of being like authoritarian without acknowledging the reason why we had to have a communist revolution to begin with. Colonialism and imperialism imposed upon us by your countries, and heavy interventionism and constant attacks to this day from your hostile and aggressive bourgeois governments. The fact is, in Vietnam, we do have a dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning our government is controlled by the majority of our people. We have a strong labor unions, rapidly improving infrastructures, and 90% of Vietnamese people own our own homes and have a full healthcare coverage. And just look at the no person left behind policy of Vietnam in the face of COVID-19 versus the genocide on legal-language nations like the USA, the UK have inflicted upon your own citizens. Look at how we sacrifice our economy again and again to save all people, and then compare to the USA. You will see the stark difference between socialist democracy and capitalist democracy. If you're a leftist in the West, especially from the imperial core, I hope you can look at what countries like Vietnam have been doing, learn some lessons from our victories, and then focus on building your own socialist movement in your countries. And also, please be aware of the lies and misinformation about countries like Vietnam and learn to investigate before you speak. There's a reason why the capitalists want you to hate and distrust Vietnam. It's because they don't want you to have what we have. Thank you so much for listening and hope we all stay strong. Solidarity.
That was fantastic, Luna. If Western democracy could be defended with such conviction as you have defended socialist democracy, it would have no problem. But since that is not so, it's in deep trouble. Because it cannot be defended, and you, people like you, have defended socialist democracy so magnificently. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Chang. Kyul is a lifelong fighter for Korean reunification and anti-imperialist causes generally. He's editor-in-chief of the 21st Century and a visiting professor at a number of universities, including Beijing's Tsinghua University, Tokyo's Korea University, and Pyongyang's Kim Il-sung University. Earlier, he was also visiting professor at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Dr. Chang was born in Korea and left to pursue his graduate studies in the United States in 1980. He was based in the USA for the next quarter century, where he earned both his MA and PhD degrees and played a leading role in the progressive Korean community. He returned to Korea in 2005 as an adjunct professor at the Methodist University and senior lecturer at Hanshin University, both in Seoul, but then soon moved to Beijing to take up academic posts there. Dr. Chang was a key organizer of the 1989 International Peace March for Korean unification that aimed to march through the northernmost to the southernmost points of the Korean peninsula, but was prevented from crossing the demilitarized zone by US occupation forces and South Korean authorities. He was also heavily involved in the Korea Truth Commission's International War Crimes Tribunal held in New York in 2001. Kyul, please go ahead.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for the invitation and honored to be part of this very timely and important gathering. I'd like to start with my own conclusion. Yesterday's Biden Summit for Democracy is, in short, just like a naked emperor circus of the 21st century. The independent journalist, The Saker, he terms this whole show, if Malcolm X was still alive, he would probably say that all the house Negroes have been invited and all the field Negroes have not. According to a new worldwide poll of 53 countries commissioned by Alliance of Democracies, I quote, "The United States is the nation that most threatens democracy worldwide." A well-known, another independent journalist, a pen name The Saker, argues this way: faithfully supporting a single world hegemony of the already dead, but never mind that they can pretend it is still alive, Anglo-Zionist empire, and obediently participate in any anti-Russian, anti-Chinese operations to prevent the latter from creating a multipolar world. The supposedly noble host nation of the so-called Summit for Democracy, the United States of America, always self-identifies itself with and is often presumed a quote-unquote freedom-loving, democratic, and observing human rights nation. However, today's global populations, including many, many Americans who seem relatively better aware, better conscious of today's geopolitical power relations issues than the past, wouldn't necessarily agree with that unmistakably narcissistic, illusionary, and self-righteous assumptions. Instead, billions of global populations would challenge the US has for centuries disguised its fundamentally imperialistic, arbitrary, never stick to the so-called rules-based order, quote unquote, plutocratic, oligarchic, unilateral, unruly, thus an outwardly appearing democracy or a pseudo-democracy. They readily, the people in the world readily argue today, the US is in essence one of the most or the worst authoritarian nations on earth. Biden's Democracy Summit yesterday, like a bad joke or farce, shows how far out of touch with realities the Washington ruling elites are. The Anglo-Zionist empire, many call today, which has been perceived as a forevermore invincible, omnipotent, and omnipresent power however, must have been thrown into a constant state of, in Korean, 혼비백산, probably translated, frightened or terrified out of one's minds, out of one's sense, or simply frightened to death, a scared to death state. The following 3 points might help us to see some of the sure signs or probable reasons why at this very moment, only 3-4 months after dramatically defeated, demoralized, and humiliated Afghanistan debacle in mid-August, the Anglo-Zionist empire seemed to have desperately tried to do something to save their such utterly disgraced face, but their hastily prepared whole global gambit turns out to be an unimaginably absurd, childish, despicable, foolish, utterly hypocritical, shameless, self-deceptive, self-inflicting game, the game of boomerang. One maximum degree of fear to lose their exclusive, hegemonic, imperialistic dominance over the world for centuries to a newly emerging multipolar world among the uncontrollably hubristic, narcissistic, self-righteous, unipolar Anglo-Zionist empire power elite. The second, the decline of the empire as the Holy Roman of the 21st century by Ryan Cooper, or as the first failed empire of the 21st century by Michael Mann, seems both irreversible and terminal, as the whole world has dramatically witnessed how the world's only superpower frantically fled from, quote unquote, one of the poorest countries in the world, Afghanistan. The naked emperor of the 21st century, Biden, called it the Afghanistan debacle. 3, the terminal illness of predatory disaster capitalism, as the world witnessed the last 2 days of time and money wasting, useless global show, seems another irrefutable testament to its final stage. Today's world seems far better conscious of Anglo-Zionist empire's ceaseless, rampant carnage, plunder, devastation, neoliberal capitalists' uncontrollable greed, and their never-dying imperial ambitions. Billions of today's global population seem ready to send their farewells to the immensely privileged American way of life, quote unquote, and the quote unquote the American way of empire by Thomas Blender. Those good old days are the past. Geneva School of Diplomacy Professor Dr. Alfred de Zayas, who was a former UN independent expert on international order, argues, observers have expressed cautious skepticism precisely because this gathering, Summit for Democracy, takes a binary approach and starts by dividing the world into us and them, excluding billions of human beings and assuming that the good guys can now show the bad guys what democracy is all about. The UN General Assembly reaffirms that while, quote, while democracies share common features, there is no single model of democracy, that it doesn't belong to any country or region. There is no patent on democracy, no one size fits all. Biden should stop provoking the world by imposing sanctions right and left and boycotting the Beijing Olympics. Democracy is much more than periodic elections. Irish independent journalist Finian Cunningham argues this way, quote, the emergence of a multipolar world is anathema to Washington's dictate for unipolar hegemony, or what it cynically calls so-called rules-based order. The ascendant reality of China as an alternative economic power and the shift in the global economy towards Eurasian integration is unbearable for the US zero-sum view of its imperial demands. A summary from yesterday's long Strategic Culture Foundation editorial, I quote some: the United States history of genocide against Native Americans, its decades of illegal foreign wars of aggression and destruction of nations, its relentless subversion of foreign governments, all of this and more are glaring proof that Washington is the center of global criminality. The biggest enemy of the basic democratic rights is the US government, and yet we have this Biden conference declaring support for democracy. Biden's two-day summit for democracy was a farce even before it began last 2 days. Now it has turned out into a vile circus for Cold War hostility that greatly threatens world democracy, human rights, and peace. The very antithesis of what the hubristic Americans claim. Ultimately, however, this charade is doomed to fail. The objective reality is of a changing world whereby US capitalist hyper-militarized power is failing amid the emergence of a multipolar international order. That fundamental historic development cannot be countered by subtle machinations. Biden's Summit for Democracy is disgusting in its fraudulence. This is not just about Joe Biden and the Democrats or the Republicans. The entire political class in the United States is bankrupt, morally, politically, and economically. It is about creating tensions, conflict, undermining democracy, and fomenting war. By it really shows the absolutely dangerous hubris of Washington. It somehow is deluded in thinking that it is uniquely endowed to host a conference on democracy when in fact, it has no shame about being a ringmaster for conflict and war. It is blatant that the convocation Biden was aimed at self-serving geopolitical power play. The territory of Taiwan was invited as a representative of democracy while China was excluded. Under US law, the one China policy deems Beijing as having sovereignty over Taiwan. So the pointed invitation of Taipei over Beijing is an astounding provocation to China by the United States. Ukraine was invited to attend while Russia was also excluded. Since the US backed the coup in Kiev 2014 against an elected government, Ukraine has become a byword for corruption and the killing of journalists. The farcical invite by Biden is another geopolitical provocation that will embolden the Kiev's neo-Nazi regime to escalate further its hostilities toward Russia. The fact, let me finish this, even invited representatives, so-called the US-backed Venezuelan interim president, the US CIA trained the puppet Juan Guaido to Washington's naked emperor circus shows how out of touch with reality this entire endeavor will be. Let me stop here. Thank you for listening, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kiyul. That was another very important set of remarks pointing to concrete realities and hypocrisies of US imperialism. Our next speaker is Roland Boer. He's professor of Marxist philosophy at the School of Marxism at Dalian University of Technology in China. Earlier, he taught at Renmin University of China and in a number of universities in Australia. He has also been visiting professor at the Academy of Marxism in Beijing, in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Among numerous works on Marxism and philosophy, he published the 5-volume work, The Criticism of Heaven and Earth. In 2014, it was awarded the Isaac and Tamara Deutsche Memorial Prize. He has recently published a monograph entitled Socialism with Chinese Characteristic, a guide for foreigners, as well as a work entitled Friedrich Engels and the Foundations of Socialist Governance. So Roland, please go ahead.
Thank you very, very much, Radhika, and thank you very much to the International Manifesto Group and Friends of Socialist China for the invitation to speak. I'm going to take a slightly different tack, and I'll begin with the point that historically there's no such thing as pure democracy. There are historical forms of democracy, and we'll just map out the major historical forms. There are many variations within them. If we begin with human societies, we can identify what should be called baseline democracy. This is characteristic in particular in tribal societies and early human forms, and included all adult participants, men and women, in deliberations over what would happen in a particular group, relationships with other groups, and so on. Engels did a lot of research on this in the 1770s and 80s, and there's been substantial research done on that since. Now, that particular form of baseline democracy arises from the socioeconomic realities of tribal societies. A second historical form we can identify is ancient Greek democracy, which was practiced in a few city-states in Greece with small populations. We have to call this slaveholder democracy. Why? Because the only people permitted to participate in the assemblies were adult males who owned at least one slave. That meant that the vast majority of people in the much vaunted ancient Greek democracy, that includes slaves, women, foreigners, etc., were excluded from the process. So it's democracy for a minority. And of course, this arises from the particular slave system, slave economy that was the reality in ancient Greece. Now, there is a third type in history. Now, in Western scholarship, this is not usually mentioned, but it is an element of Chinese scholarship on the history of democracy, and this is feudal democracy. We can, if you like, speak of a kind of feudal democracy among the aristocracy or among the nobility, in the sense that there was a reasonably highly developed sense of individuality and interaction between the nobility, and they would typically enable all sorts of deals, sit on advisory panels for the monarch and so on. Historically, and the one we've been talking about more is the one that arose perhaps 200 years ago in Europe, and that's capitalist democracy. They like to call it liberal democracy, but as Carlos Martinez pointed out recently, that's because they don't actually want to call it capitalist democracy. There are many, many features we've already discussed. I would like to highlight three features of it. The first one, it boils down usually to the expression of the people's will, if you like, in terms of elections. Now, these happen periodically, 2, 3, 4 years. In some countries, they're more frequent, such as in Switzerland, over policy things. But it's actually a very thin notion of democracy. It's restricted to elections. The second feature is that it's a highly antagonistic form of democracy. And we see this all the time, where the political parties are more interested in scoring political points against each other. Everything is politicized, and you find efforts to bring down the opponent by whatever means possible, whatever scandal, gossip, or whatever can be brought forward. The best example of this is the atrocious effort to try and deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. You see this, the worst situation in the United States of America or in England and so on. And why? Well, because health, which should obviously and simply be a concern for the well-being of health of everybody, becomes a political football that's tossed back and forth and so on. And this is even the case here, obviously in Denmark, where it's constantly, where I'm currently, it's constantly politicized, and measures go up and down and so on and so forth. And of course, it's obvious that the politicized nature, or as Marx and Engels called it, the political character, is based on class and class conflict. The third feature that some of us have already mentioned is the obvious fragmentation and decline of capitalist democracy. This has been apparent, particularly since it was believed in the Western countries that they had achieved the pinnacle of human civilization due to a 40 or even 50-year decline in Western capitalist countries. And so the manifestation of this is in all sorts of ways. The prevalence of conspiracy theories, the narrative of the anti-vaxxers, social unrest, chronic lack of trust in governance and government institutions. It sits around the 40 to 45% mark in capitalist countries. Clearly, fragmentation and decline. And the fifth type I'll mention briefly is, of course, socialist democracy, which is our focus here. This already has a history of development in different contexts in light of specific conditions for 100 years or more, from the Soviet Union through to the present day. We find it manifested in what has recently been called in China the whole process people's democracy, the integration of a whole series of components, electoral democracy, but also very much integrated and dialectically related consultative democracy and its important subgroup, grassroots democracy. And you also have, as has been mentioned, the crucial role of the leadership of the Communist Party in socialist democracies. Now, for Westerners, this one is particularly difficult to understand. How can you have leadership of the Communist Party when you have a democracy? Well, I mean, maybe a beginning is stop thinking in either or categories and think in both and categories. So socialist democracy is enhanced by the leadership of the Communist Party, and the leadership of the Communist Party is enhanced through socialist democracy. And then there is the crucial role, of course, and closely tied with this, with the role of rule of law, socialist rule of law, ruling the country according to law. So there's 5 integrated components in this whole process: electoral, consultative, grassroots, leadership of the Communist Party, and rule of law. Now, I said at the beginning, there's no pure form of democracy, but if we go back to the basic sense of the term, Greek demokratia, minju in Chinese, it means the rule of the people. The people are masters of the country. So there are historically better forms of democracy, and it's becoming clear, more clear, with the examples we've heard today in many other ways, from Venezuela, from Vietnam, also from China, and so on, that socialist democracy is a superior form of democracy. And the simple reason is that socialism is far more democratic than capitalism. Thank you.
What a clear and wonderful conclusion. Thank you so much, Roland. That was a great survey of democratic forms, something which people don't often talk about. Our next speaker is Isabel Monal Rodriguez. She's the director of the Department of Marxist Studies at the Academy of Sciences in Cuba. She's a member of the International Council for the Historical Critical Dictionary of Marxism. She's member and chairman of the section on the social sciences of the Economic Society of Friends of the Country, SEAP, member of the Cuban Society for Philosophical Research, and founder and director of Marx Now magazine. We're really honored to have you here, Isabel. Please go ahead. You are muted, Isabel. There. We can't still hear you, Isabel. I cannot hear you. I still cannot hear you. Yeah, can you, I can't hear you, Vitalina. No, not yet. Okay, can we take Isabel next while you fix that issue? And I will come back to Isabel. I will introduce the next speaker. And then in the meantime, you can fix the problem. Yeah, can you, is that all right? Okay, great. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Sorry about that, everyone. Just some technical difficulties here. Okay, so our next speaker then will be Chu Han Park, who is a writer who organizes with the Nodutol for Korean Community Development. Nodutol was founded in 1999 as an organization for first through fourth generation Korean Americans. Nodutol organizes for a world free of imperialism and for Korea's reunification and national liberation. So, Chuhan, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Radhika. And I'd like to start by thanking the International Manifesto Group and Friends of Socialist China on behalf of Nodutol for organizing this event. Thanks as well to everyone in attendance. It's a pleasure to be here among all of you at such an important time. Last week in the United States, the Supreme Court heard a major case concerning Mississippi's abortion ban. Now, during this hearing, Justice Roberts made a very interesting statement about China and North Korea's abortion laws. He said he was concerned that existing US abortion law protected by Roe versus Wade is too lenient. And he incorrectly claimed that only China and North Korea allow for abortions as late as the US does. By this line of thinking, Mississippi's abortion ban should be upheld and the fundamental rights of millions of people violated, all to keep the US from becoming like North Korea. I'm not here today to focus too much on the Supreme Court, but I do want to ask a question that I believe is relevant to today's summit. How was it even possible in the first place for this kind of nonsense argument to be made by a member of the highest court in the US? There's two parts to that answer, in my opinion. For one, Justice Roberts was actually borrowing his argument from the very Mississippi lawmakers who passed the abortion ban, using North Korea and China as one of several arguments for what we might call their reproductive injustice agenda. But to zoom out a little bit, this kind of rhetoric is only possible if the vast majority of the American people have been actively taught that China and North Korea, or the DPRK, are unfree, undemocratic societies. This is the case, and we must understand how the US uses this manufactured ignorance to disguise its repression as liberation. To understand how this is happening, we also need to understand the truth about Korea, which is my topic for today. To begin, abortion is legal and widely available throughout the DPRK. Maternity leave is guaranteed for up to 240 days, longer than in most countries. Childcare and healthcare are not only free, they are considered constitutional rights. And in cases where children can't be cared for by their families, the state assumes full responsibility for their upbringing and education, even after that child becomes an adult. I'd like to say a little more about North Korea's constitution. North Koreans have the freedom of speech, religion, assembly, the right to vote, the right to personal property, protection from undue search and seizure, etc. In fact, there are many rights in the DPRK's constitution that are not considered rights elsewhere, particularly in the United States. Housing, education, food, equal gender rights, culture and arts, and as mentioned earlier, healthcare and childcare are all considered constitutional rights. There is even a constitutional right to relaxation. And what that means is everyone gets vacation time and everyone gets access to public vacation resorts. This is the reality of socialist democracy in North Korea, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. In North Korea, it's the people themselves who run society, whether through the state or mass organizations. Most people think that Kim Jong-un is running a one-man show, but this is a view born out of the same manufactured ignorance I referenced earlier. Most people who say this could not tell you Kim Jong-un's government title, which is very telling. His government title is the first chairman of the State Affairs Committee. The State Affairs Committee is a body that creates state policy, and it is not the highest organ of state power. That's the Supreme People's Assembly, which is a directly elected legislative body which has the power to elect, appoint, and recall the members of the judiciary, the prosecutor's office, the cabinet, and finally the State Affairs Committee, including its first chairman, Kim Jong-un. Assembly members are subject to immediate recall themselves. They get no additional salary, and they retain their regular jobs after being elected. There's no corporate campaign contributions or professional politicians in the same way that we understand them in the US or other imperial core countries. So what does the US mean when it says it wants North Koreans to enjoy freedom and democracy? Well, let's look at what they're actually doing. Today, the US has North Korea under siege. 28,500 US soldiers occupy South Korea. And every year, the US holds war exercises that rehearse invasions of the North, sometimes with as many as 300,000 troops. The entire South Korean military is under the command of the US and has been since 1950. Functionally, the South Korean military is a reserve US army. South Korea has mandatory military service precisely because it needs to ensure that the US has enough cannon fodder for any potential conflict. The US also has North Korea under sanctions, which the rest of the world is forced to follow. North Korea can't trade with other countries, they can't get international loans, or import fuel or really much of anything else. North Koreans can't even import items that have metal in them. Think about that. Look around your room right now or wherever it is that you're watching this from. How many things require metal? The screws in your furniture, the copper wire in your light bulb, the pipes that bring you clean water, everything. Sanctions impact everything from agriculture, industry, and medicine. Most things North Koreans need, they have to produce for themselves. There is no shipping it in from anywhere else. A study conducted by the organization Korea Peace Now confirmed almost 4,000 deaths in just 2018 from delays and shortages to UN aid programs caused by sanctions. These deaths included 72 pregnant people and over 3,000 children under the age of 5, better known as toddlers. The same study found, and I quote, 99% of pregnant women in North Korea did not have access to emergency reproductive kits to assist with life-threatening complications during pregnancy. The US's attacks on reproductive rights included sanctions against North Korea. When the US says it wants freedom for North Korea's people, this is what they mean. The freedom to die during childbirth or during childhood, the freedom to go hungry, the freedom to perish from preventable disease. With one hand, the US condemns human rights in North Korea, and with the other, it violates those very rights on its own. What else do we call it when they attack North Koreans' right to live, their right to food, their right to healthcare, their right to independently develop their society and raise their standard of living? Now, does this mean the DPRK is a paradise? It doesn't. But so what? The DPRK is a poor country with a history of colonial and imperialist exploitation, living in a hostile world bent on its destruction. It's not a paradise because it's part of the real world. It's a socialist society in transition to communism that is contending with the realities of actually existing imperialism. And in order to achieve communism, you have to have a certain level of material development. You can't guarantee food for all your people if you are prevented by sanctions from producing enough food. And you can't dedicate all your resources to improving society if you have to simultaneously fend off the imperialists who want to recolonize you. North Korea is a real human society that is subject to the same laws of historical development that apply everywhere else. It is a complicated place. But the most basic reality in North Korea is this. North Koreans are making every effort to construct a society that can provide for everyone's basic needs. And at every turn, they are impeded, undermined, and sabotaged by the forces of imperialism. Anyone who doubts this need only look to the new sanctions President Biden imposed on the DPRK yesterday, while the so-called Summit for Democracy was wrapping up. This is why the DPRK's military and nuclear arsenal are strategic necessities, because the US is still at war in Korea. To this day, the US refuses to sign a peace treaty with the DPRK because it would rather destroy North Korea than have peace. The DPRK says it needs all hostilities to end before it can come to the table, including sanctions. But the US refuses to do this. It could drop the sanctions today, and tomorrow the peace negotiations would begin. But it won't do this because the US will accept nothing less than the utter destruction of the North Korean system. It's precisely because the Korean War is ongoing that an understanding of and solidarity with the DPRK and the Korean people as one people are so important. Through 71 years of conflict, the Korean War has reshaped the world. This is your history too, not just ours. It is our shared past, our shared present. McCarthyism first blossomed in the United States in the international context of the Korean War. The military-industrial complex as we know it today was born through the Korean War. Today, imperialist aggression against North Korea is used to justify all manner of domestic and international oppression, from the abortion ban in Mississippi to the latest US defense budget, which stands at $768 billion and includes new funding for new militarization across the Pacific and the entire world. History is still in motion, and all of us are subjects of history. As human beings, we can either participate in it consciously or unconsciously, but we can never escape it. The US is pushing the world down a dangerous path, but it is not an inevitable one. Another kind of future is possible. Another kind of freedom is possible, but only when the masses become conscious of their role in history and organized to realize it. And to do this, we need to begin with the truth. We can't start with lies. The truth about North Korea can't hurt you. It can only reveal the truth about the system you live under, who your enemies are, and what role in history you have to play. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm sure I'm not the only one who is feeling so lucky that we have such brilliant speakers. This last speech was another really searingly truthful speech. So thank you very much for that. Isabel, are you ready now? Can you just say one word so we can make sure we can hear you? You have to unmute yourself first. You have to unmute yourself first.
And now?
Okay, now please wait. Please wait, I will introduce you again so that people who may pick up in the middle know who you are. So we are about to hear from our next speaker. She's Elizabeth Monal Rodriguez. She's director of the Department of Marxist Studies at the Academy of Sciences of Cuba. She's also a member of the International Council of the Historical Critical Dictionary of Marxism, member and chairman of the section of social sciences of the Economic Society of Friends of the Country, and member of the Cuban Society for Philosophical Research. She is also founder and director of Marx Now magazine. We're very lucky to have you, Isabel. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank particularly you and the colleagues from Manifesto in general for inviting me to this meeting. And I am very happy that I'm chairing this meeting with so many distinguished and interesting talk and speech from the colleagues that have preceded me with their intervention. The subject of socialist democracy, which is, as we know, essential, and for the most possible complete socialist society, and moreover, to what it is, according to my point of view, correct, the construction of a socialist society. So, socialist society is a period, is constructed, and at the same time is a transitional. All this has to bear upon what democracy for this society is. At the beginning, I wish to remember or underline that democracy as part of a broad society is an organic part of this society, including, of course, its history and with wide, rich interrelationship among its various components. Regarding this point, it is necessary to keep in mind as a reference Marx's concept and theory of the economic social formation, this essential, absolutely key concept of Marx theory. Democracy, then, any kind of democracy, is to be understood and conceived as part or component of this economic social formation. That is the totality. On the other hand, we are also to keep in mind that the starting process of the construction of a socialist society, this new society inherits up to a certain point the existence of the liberal bourgeois democracy. This, of course, in the cases where historically the new stage or the new starting point, that is socialist society, emergence from a previous liberal democracy society, but not other forms like we know that exists. Even in these cases, let's say, for example, in Latin America, with such a history of dictatorship since the first independence during the second and third decade of the 19th century for most of the countries of the continent. So very few countries like my own Cuba, which did not took part in the first period of the first independence war, but we are arrived to that almost many decades later. But at the very beginning, in the Latin American, I like to call this the first independence, because we speak today of the need of a second independence. And for most of the countries, even with all this history of dictatorships since the beginning of the 19th century, right after the first independence started, we find references of processes with elements, at least in a formal manner, of liberal democracy. The subject of democracy implies also the state and the subject of the civil society, as well as, and this is also of the utmost importance, the relationship of the two, that is, the relationship between the state and civil society, which was key to Marx, as it was key, for example, to Gramsci, as we all know. The relationship between the two, the question that Marx pointed out since the period of his youth, that is, since 1843, with the Jewish question, in the sense that the new society has to overcome the separation between state and civil societies, which occurred during the capitalist society period. That is, for the new society, socialism and future communism, both of them had to re-meet again, to come together again. And Marx understood that as an essential characteristic for the new society. This, for me, is very important if we have to develop a broad sense of democracy. For socialism, with all models and a variety of models, but there are essential points that has to be kept in mind. And this, for me, is one of them. Whatever model, the way in which them both are meeting again can change from country to country, from one experience to the other. But the idea that they have to come together again, it seems to me, has to be a key characteristic of the socialist society. The idea of this idea of coming, let's say, together of both of them was never abandoned by Marx. In the 18 Brumaire, he did mention organizations of the bourgeoisie as part of the civil society. So including organizations which we do not find so clearly in the period of youth. And then, as we also need to remember, this idea was stressed in Marx's text, Civil War in France, that is related to the Paris Commune. And there, if we remember a little bit, is one of the essential points for Marx, that the state do not, let's say, eat civil society, but civil society also needs a state. They have to come together. I like to say sometimes that what puts them together is that they have the same project for society, and the society as a whole construct the new project. Creating a lot has to be very creative, but on realistic basis. Realistic here, I mean adequate understanding what society and history are. So I wish to underline the idea of the intimate relationship between the idea of democracy in the new society and Marx's thesis of the need of meeting a state and civil society. Marx and Engels never tried to imagine or conceived in an ideal or abstract way how this new socialist society would be. They almost say nothing about it. There are some essential key issues, but they say almost nothing about it. And that we have to understand, because we have to learn from that too. They didn't know. So no abstraction, no creative invention without adequate support from reality. And reality meant economics, politics, traditions, everything, the totality. So this is essential. They didn't go into that because they just didn't know. And they, in their letter, particularly, you can see that they say, well, as history goes and society changes, that we will know. I mean, the proletariat and the oppressed people will know what to do when the moment comes. From how this new society would be, so no imagination in that sense. From the important events taking place in Europe during the time they arrived, during the time they were analyzing society, they arrived to the conception, interpretation, theory, which enriched the general view. Allow now me to remind that that first it was of the need to take or seize the political power. They then learned that this was not enough. I remind you of that. It's not enough, and that the machine or the machinery of the state, of the bourgeois state, had to be destroyed. But then stayed the question about what is going to replace the old machine that had been destroyed. And then the problem is they didn't know. And they acknowledge it. And we learn from that. Acknowledge we do not know. Again, they stay open, these questions stay open for many years. And then again, they did not invent outside reality of society or of history. This is new machine, how this new machine, let's say machine, it's a metaphor, of course, would be. Marx and Engels considered the French Commune, as you remember, as the new form. And I want to underline now the word that Marx uses, finally discovered. So this finally, so transmits to us this endeavor, this thinking, but always restraining themselves or going beyond what they could do. So finally, they found something. And this expression tells us about a method also. They did not know what form would this new state would take, and therefore, what form this new democracy would be, what kind, what form, what ways, what to keep from the old liberal experience of liberal bourgeois democracy, because that existed. It's not something that is just going to be thrown like that. No, there are things to learn from this experience of humankind.
If you could wrap up soon, Isabel.
Excuse me?
If you could wrap up soon.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Yes. No, but just, yeah.
Yes. So this has to fit into this totality and establish links and being coherent with the rest of society, taking also into consideration social classes and the question of power. I now, this question of time, I want to then maybe skip some. I wanted to say, then I would not read, I will just, I want to underline the idea that socialist democracy is a new type of democracy. It's not another kind of democracy, but a new type. But a new type that is essentially different from any other kind of society, of democracy that could exist. It's a new type from bourgeois democracy. It's not a new democracy, but a new type of democracy. Now, this new type of democracy implies then the variety of model, but always in the line that is within that this kind of democracy has to be a different type, including the overcoming of inequality, the participation of the people or of all citizens, not only electing and then forgetting, but doing, like, for example, we do in Cuba for the new constitution. It's not that we voted the constitution also. It's that the text of the constitution was discussed by everybody in the island. Well, of course, children did not participate. And the opinion of the people were taken into consideration. The text of the constitution was changed according to our proposals, and a final revision was proposed to the people for the votation. So then it's then that the election and the form of the using voting comes into the situation. And finally, because this has been a real problem today in Latin America, imperialism. United States imperialism, the most terrible imperialism that mankind had known, is really doing everything they can to avoid that the new democracies of Latin America can really blossom, develop, go ahead. Even the FMI, the imperialists have invented the form that when the new links or progressive government comes into government, they can do very little, because the FMI and other forms has created such a force that it do not let the new governments go ahead with their changes. And that is the real danger for all kind of democracy, socialist or liberal democracy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Thank you for underlining the dangers of this Biden summit, of so-called summit of democracies. And also, I feel that your remarks lead me to suggest that perhaps we should have a WWMES session. That is to say, what would Marx and Engels say? A session on all the existing socialist projects, as though, what would Marx and Engels say if they were looking over the shoulder of the people who are trying to build socialisms today? I think that would be a fantastic idea. So thank you for putting that idea among us and for your wonderful reflections. Our final three speakers now, the first of them will be Chang. I believe that's how you say it, but Probably I'm making a mess of it. But anyway, Professor Zhai is a professor of constitutional law and deputy director of the Institute of International Law at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. He has published widely on matters of constitutional and international law in China. And most recently, he has published a book entitled Research on the Method of Constitutional Decision, a comparative study, published by Tsinghua University Press. So Professor Zhai, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, madam. It's my honor to be here to share the experience of democracy in China. Now, I'd like to say all democracy is equal, and we are all on the way to democracy. And democracy has not only one model. Now, I would like to share the experience of Chinese democracy from a perspective of rule of law. Now, China is a transitional society. It's still on the way to modernization, and also still on the way to rule of law, and also to democracy. A traditional Chinese society is, we can call it a governance based on relation. The Chinese character is 关系. It's very hard to translate into English. Yeah. Now it's on the way to relation-based governance to the role-based governance, namely rule of law. Yeah. Many Western scholars call Chinese democracy authoritarian state, but it's not right. Yeah, I would like to introduce some institution of Chinese democracy. For example, firstly, the democracy in legislation. Yeah, in China, all the people can find any legal document on the internet. For example, the National People's Congress or local People's Congress, and it's very communicated freely. Yeah, and people can give suggestion to the National People's Congress, even when ordinary Chinese people can suggest to the National People's Congress on the internet. For example, if you find out any legal document is unconstitutional, you can send an email to the National People's Congress, and the National People's Congress will review the constitutionality of the legal document. It's very convenient. You can finish all the work on internet, and the National People's Congress will just send you email. Yeah. So if you find if you find some legal draft is on the process, so you can give suggestion to the Congress, and it's open to all the public. And this is a democracy in legislation. And also in the administrative process, it's very convenient for ordinary Chinese people to connect it with the public official. For example, the public, you can ask the administrative branch to open the information of their work. And if the public, if the administrative branch refuses this, you can take litigation to the court and to ask the court to satisfy your sue. Yeah. So in China, if you want to help to ask for help from the administrative, you can just give a call to the administrative branch. The number is 12345. It's very freely convenient to ask the help. Yeah, and for the judicial procedure, it's also play a very, very important function in the democracy. For example, in China, you can download all the judgment from internet, from the Supreme People's Court, the website of the Supreme People's Court. Then, and also it's freely. You can find the judgment in the website, download it freely. Yeah. And in China, we have some very special court called internet court. You can take actions on the internet. It's very convenient for all the people, and the people needing to go to the court. Yeah, and that's the court is play very important role in the democracy. And also, some Western states criticize the human rights protection of China. But actually, it's not the truth. For example, the people have enjoyed more freedom, more freedom than the Western society. And the truly problem is the limitation of the right, not to the protection of the right, because it's China still is on the way to rule of law, and the definition, limitation of the right protection is not so clear, not so exactly. So some people criticize the right protection, yeah, but that's not true. And also now, many people, most people in the world now, China, the government of China have just published the white paper, yeah, of the Chinese democracy called Democracies That Works. Democracy is not the last thing of the world. It has some value. For example, the people's happiness, the people's dignity. That's the value, basic value of the society. And the Chinese people call the democracy in China whole process democracy. Yeah, this democracy can satisfy all the people and protect the basic rights of all the people. Why the Chinese democracy called whole process democracy? The key point is leadership of the Communist Party. Yeah, the tension between rule of law and human rights. The tension between the rule of law and democracy is a common problem of all the states, whenever Western state or Oriental state. But in China, how to solve this problem? The answer is leadership of Communist Party. And just because the leadership of the Communist Party, it can avoid the situation of dictatorship of majority, and to protect the interest and rights of minority. So the Communist Party is have very complex institution and organization. In all the government branch, the Communist Party insisted to keep in touch with the people, always keep in touch with all the people in all the process of the governance. So that's why the Chinese democracy called whole process democracy. Yeah. So that's what I want to say. Thank you, madam. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for opening up the whole world of socialist legality and the ongoing, I think, effort of the revolutionary China to build socialist legality. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Leila Brown-Vincent, who is Assistant Professor of Cultural Anthropology and African Studies at Northeastern University. She's currently on leave as a Senior Research Fellow at the Kate Hamburger Kolleg Center for Global Cooperation and Research in Duisburg in Germany. She's the author of The Fire Now, Anti-Racist Scholarship in Times of Explicit Racial Violence. She is, along with Charis Burdenstelli, co-host of The Last Dope Intellectual, a radical Black podcast covering a wide range of social and political issues. So Leila, it's great to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to say thanks for the invitation, and just want to say that I contributed to that volume. I'm not an author on that volume. Just want to make that public. So, I've been thinking about the nature of my contributions for today because I'm appreciative of the interventions of so many that have gone before me. And so I wanted to start by referencing a report that came out. So recently, according to a report by the International Idea think tank that came out just last month, the US found itself on this list of so-called backsliding democracies. And this is supposedly for the first time, right? And this is linked to supposedly the Trump years, and some of the measures that were used to make this decision were people's loss of confidence in the so-called democratic process in the U.S., pushbacks against freedom of assembly, which we saw largely in the summer of 2020 amidst the George Floyd protests. But what I really found interesting about this assertion that this happens to be the case for the first time is that even just over the scope of the last 20 years, it ignores things like the 2001 presidential election of George Bush, where he was essentially determined president by the Supreme Court, where there was so much debate and fight over sort of election and voter fraud. And then even if we go back further than that, to the sort of origins of this country. The US is a settler colonial project that was made possible only through the dispossession and genocidal atrocities committed against indigenous peoples, and then fortified by the dispossession, the disenfranchisement, and the forced labor of enslaved Africans. And that those two things made it possible to create a sort of this so-called capitalist bourgeois democracy. So whatever nominal democracy can be found in the US must be first and foremost challenged by the country's inability to acknowledge the humanity and facilitate a dignified life for the two ethnic groups of people who have formed the sort of basis of this country, right? And even as Luna already mentioned, when she cited Nguyen's critique of the democratic process in the U.S., that the Republican and Democratic parties essentially represent two sides of the same coin. They fundamentally have the same interest. There might be some very nominal differences in the way some domestic policies are implemented, but when it comes to international policies, they essentially share the same positions. But what's also interesting is that the US fundamentally understands itself as a democracy based on electoral processes, right? And these sort of liberal notions of the idea of the individual. But even if we assess the sort of democratic nature of the capitalist bourgeois democracy in the US on its own terms and based on its own metrics, we see that even based on that, it is a failure, right? Because we know that in the US, less than half of the population participates, less than half even of the voter eligible population participates in electoral processes, right? And so that means that we have a country that is largely governed by, it is not governed by the consent of the majority. It is governed by a select few people who have been, for the most part, lied and coerced into electoral processes. And it's interesting because one of the things that, according to the so-called the Declaration of Independence, that we're supposed to have access to in this country is the right to depose elected officials when they are no longer maintaining their promises, right? So that we're supposed to be, that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute new government. But this is something that is ostensibly out of reach, and in any sort of practical way is out of reach to us in the US. But beyond that, it's something that I think is inconceivable to most US citizens. There's no denying the fact that coups d'etats are largely a result of sort of political sort of disruption and order. But one of the things that I think is interesting about coups d'etats and our inability to enact them in the US is that I actually do think that they represent when they are not military coup d'etats. When they are not military coup d'etats, they represent a fundamental belief in the ability to hold people accountable, to hold our officials accountable to the promises that they make. We really, for all intents and purposes, lack that ability to do so in the US. I think two of the other sort of more egregious ways that we see the farce or the joke of American democracy is the US complicity in supporting the genocidal settler colonial project of Israel, and its determination to impose Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela, a person who in January 2019, when he was supposed to be president, less than 1% of the country knew his name, right? But I think even in the context of the US, what becomes interesting in this moment as we see fights over critical race theory, we see a fundamental fight over the educational project in the US. And there seems to be in the US a refusal to create a fundamentally educated critical electorate or population, right? And there is an interest in divesting from public education. And so I think two of the sort of most fundamental ways that we can see what a democratic state, the commitment of a democratic state to its people are investments in education and healthcare and housing, right? And that is something that we fundamentally see the US lacking. And so what I wanted to maybe end on is a reflection that I made last year in watching the way that Cuba and Venezuela handled the COVID-19 pandemic in contradistinction to the sort of way that the US handled the pandemic. So in the immediate aftermath of the triumph of the Cuban Revolution, Castro and his cabinet, based on the logic informing socialist beliefs that everyone has an equal right to life and dignity, poured significant amounts of government resources into universal healthcare and educational systems. Revolutionary Cuban internationalism is a product of the desire to counter the prevailing McCarthyan logic of the day and spread revolutionary socialist ideas in Africa, Latin America, and the rest of the world. For more than 6 decades, the Cuban internationalism has been seen at play all over the world. The country is perhaps best known for its medical diplomacy programs, sending doctors all over the world, mostly to so-called developing nations. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, Cuba and Venezuela were among the first countries to offer assistance, even before the national, state, or even local Louisiana governments. The US State Department rejected these offers of assistance. When in 2010, Haiti was devastated by a massive earthquake and subsequent tremors, the US State Department once again attempted to block much needed aid from Venezuela, as well as other foreign aid, while opting to send more than 6,000 US troops to effectively enact a military occupation. Then Foreign Minister Nicolas Maduro reported that aid shipments to Haiti were being diverted via the neighboring Dominican Republic to avoid restrictions imposed by the US at the Port-au-Prince airport. Doctors Without Borders has also criticized the US prioritization of military logistics over food and medical aid, saying planes carrying urgently needed surgical equipment and drugs have been turned away 5 times, and even though the agency received prior authorization to land. During the same period, thanks to Venezuelan-owned Citgo Oil's heating subsidies, thousands of American citizens received heating services for several brutal Northeastern winters. The COVID-19 pandemic presented a unique and almost unprecedented opportunity for Cuba to enact its medical diplomacy all over the world, even in so-called developed nations that have attempted to condemn the country to the status of perpetual political pariah. In mid-March of 2020, a British cruise ship had at least 5 individuals on board who tested positive for the novel coronavirus. An additional 22 guests and 21 crew members were isolated because they were experiencing influenza-like symptoms. After weeks of being stranded at sea because many Caribbean countries refused to allow them to dock for fear of spreading the virus, Cuba, out of humanitarian concern, allowed the ship to dock at their Mariel port, as part of what they understood as their responsibility in a global shared effort to confront and stop the spread of the pandemic. The Cuban government allowed the ship with approximately 600 British nationals on board to dock and begin the repatriation process. Later that same month, more than 50 Cuban doctors arrived in Italy's worst affected region, Lombardy, to help fight the virus. In late April, more than 200 Cuban doctors arrived in South Africa to help fight the virus there. Similar delegations were sent to Venezuela, Nicaragua, Jamaica, Suriname, and Grenada, to name a few. Despite the decades-long embargo imposed on Cuba by the United States and its neocolonial allies, COVID-19 has provided an opportunity for the Cuban government to demonstrate the moral imperative driving its support to life across the globe, its support for life across the globe, even as the racial capitalist interests of the US attempted to starve the nation. In neighboring Venezuela, after successive failed coup attempts to falsely impose Guaido as the US declared president of Venezuela, the US, during a global pandemic with the highest unemployment rate since the Great Depression and an epidemic of racialized state-sanctioned violence, issued a $15 million reward for information leading to the arrest of Venezuelan President Maduro, who the US Drug Enforcement Agency charged with narco-terrorism and drug trafficking, among other charges. The funneling of money into efforts to destabilize the Venezuelan government, while at the same time refusing to provide the necessary financial and sanitary assistance to its most vulnerable citizens back home, clearly demonstrates the United States' great lack of care and concern for human life. Despite the US unrelenting obsession and a severely damaged economy, Venezuela has attempted to manage the virus in a way that grants its citizens the most dignity possible. In June 2020, President Maduro participated in an online forum with the education minister and vice president of social and territorial development, who's now deceased, Aristóbulo Isturiz, and Roraima Gutierrez, Secretary General of the International Imperialist Cumbé of African and Afro Descendants, which was formed in November of 2019. The forum featured a discussion about Afro-descendant responses in the context of COVID-19. Maduro characterized the meeting as a continuation of initiatives that we have undertaken to coordinate the fight of social movements for justice against racism, colonialism, and oppression. And he went on to express his solidarity with the victims of police brutality, and in particular, the family of George Floyd. He concluded by asserting that the Venezuelan people have a lot of strength and conscience. They cannot keep us down. Our people are standing up. Venezuela shows its solidarity with the fight for equality, for a better and new society. Concerning COVID-19, more specifically, Maduro contrasted the situation with the situation in the US and in Brazil, where racism and economic interests take precedence over human lives, by calling attention to the fact that in Venezuela, nothing is charged to anyone. Tests have no charge, and this is we've gone back and forth with charging tests or not.
If you could wrap up soon, Leila.
Yes, I will. While far from utopias, Venezuela and Cuba's early handling of the COVID-19 pandemic exhibit a combination of strategies, policies, and perhaps most importantly, worldviews that promote the preservation of life over the accumulation of profit. Despite its self-conception as a world leader, the US has demonstrated everything but leadership. It is my hope that this discussion inspires a closer look at the projects underway in these two countries and others without the shroud of racial capitalist consumer logics promoted by world powers like the US and its crony countries. The fundamental right to life is what is at stake in determining what this post-COVID-19 world order could look like. We can choose to continue with business as usual, or we can choose to defend our right to the fundamental right to life, and learn from the examples of established and budding socialist democracies like Cuba and Venezuela in order to conceive of the new world that we must all believe is indeed possible. Thank you. Radhika, I believe you're muted.
Thanks very much, Leila. That was really very inspiring again. Our final speaker is Elias Jabor. Elias is a professor at the School of Economics, State University of Rio de Janeiro. He is the author of many books, including most recently, China, Socialist Economic Development in the 21st Century, the English version of which will be available in March 2022. He's a central committee member of the Communist Party of Brazil. So Elias, please provide your conclusion to our deliberations. Elias?
Okay, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you, Radhika. I'm very happy to be here again between great friends and great comrades. A warm embrace for all direct from Brazil. We just heard a brilliant presentation about socialist democracy in Cuba, in China, Vietnam, and People's Korea, and Venezuela. In this sense, I chose to do comments on the surreal summit for the democracy led by the United States in this weekend. And confess, I spent the last days looking for a word or a concept to define the summit for democracy led by the United States. Historically, is the most, in my point of view, the first impression was the link between these events, the surreal event with the one of the most obscure meeting since the Vienna Congress 2 centuries ago. It's the same principles between them. But I followed my native instincts. We Brazilians have the habit of using a good sense of humor in face with great inconsistency. I might say that in view of the event led by the United States called the Summit for Democracy, my first reaction one can have is to believe that we are facing an immense joke. The name of this presentation is the Summit for Democracy, or the Joke of the Year, for example, the name of my presentation. But also, the perplexing moment fades. We are forced to deal with the facts. 2 points. Yes, United States imperialism, the great murders and corrupting power in history, has decided to organize an event in favor of democracy. The matter becomes more serious as we come to understand not only the hypocrisy behind the event, but the interests that surround it, dark interests. First, let's talk about a bit about democracy in the US. It's interesting to note that a country that promotes its rights to define the concepts and leads the defense of democracy and human rights has the popularity of its presidents determined by war decisions. In other words, the two most popular presidents in recent US history, Bush father and Bush Jr., reached almost 90% of popularity after the decisions to unleash two attacks on Iraq, 1991 and 2003. Such aggressions are part of what have called an attempt to impose a global military dictatorship, using fancy concepts to deceive the international public opinion. American democracy is the greatest lie factory in history. Wise was the prophecy. Let's understand it. Wise was the prophecy of communist leader and president of Third International, George Dimitrov, in his historical trial on the occasion of the Reichstag fire in 1933, when he predicted that fascism and Nazism is a typical phenomenon of capitalism. And pay attention, certainly the next fascist wave will come from the other side of Atlantic. This is the forecast from George Dimitrov. This means that the summit is part of a political architecture of a new colonial character. Since the 90s, the United States imperialism has promoted, in the name of democracy, major military interventions and widespread semiotic warfare, with the clear intention of dividing, subjecting, and or destroying entire societies. Sponsoring color revolutions, promoting coups d'état disgraced of legality in Latin America, and economic strangulation of countries like Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, and People Korea, are crimes against humanity that must be remembered every day by the real defense of democracy peace, and the right of nations to self-determination. If some countries bravely resist, others succumb to fascism waves. We are in Latin America, we are living a fast wave. I'm not surprised that a fascist like Jair Bolsonaro, a fascist, was invited to the summit for democracy. Jair Bolsonaro is a friend of democracy, people. I'm so sorry. Jair Bolsonaro is the most complete expression of fascism sponsored by imperialism around the world. The United States, my point of view, is the greatest threat to the human species, as lethal as global warming. Sponsorship of global fascism is only one side of the coin. Internally, human rights violations, racism, and science denial is the tonic. A country that murdered leaders like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X is the same country that supported South Africa apartheid until its end. United States has the largest prison population in the world, 2 million prisoners. And among 80% of them are Black people. Let's not forget as well that the first 10 US presidents were slave owners. Bill Clinton, 30 years ago, in a speech, secondly, according to him, United States was born like a democracy, but he forgets the first 10 presidents were, United States presidents were slave owners. And that is no secret that racial segregation in the United States, pay attention, please, again. It's no secret that racial segregation in the United States was a great source of inspiration for Nazi leaders like Goebbels and Himmler. It's well known that a large portion of American population flirts with far-right ideas. True democracies promotes a culture of tolerance and coexistence with difference. To be black or late in the United States is to have your life at risk all the time. US democracy is a big hoax. 91% of US Congress belongs to the capitalist class. The last elections for president and Congress cost $15 billion. No Chomsky pointed out that 70% of the population in the United States has no ability to change the course of United States policy. Some billionaire families control the media and the formation of the so-called public opinion, and the president of the highest number of votes is not necessarily declared the winner. Moreover, the United States electoral system is based, pay attention again, this is a historical fact, interesting fact. Moreover, the United States electoral system is based on a great deal between the Civil War winners and the slaveholders. The slave masters, requirement to have states with greater or lesser electoral weights, and the creation of the Senate was met and remains in a full force. There are many cases in which the votes on Black and Latinos are not even counted in the United States. Finally, apart from the discussion and concept of democracy, there is a very dangerous process going on that directly affect the People's Republic of China. The moral decay of the West finds its greatest expression in fascism. The language of fascism is very clear. 2 points. War, in my point of view, United States is the great promoter of fascism in the world now. In fact, the Summit for Democracy is not just a joke. I'm serious now. It's way more serious. Imperialism seeks to create an internal and an external environment to deepen the encirclement of the Chinese socialist experience. Imperialist aggression against China, directly or indirectly, is at the top of Biden's agenda. Thank you too much.
Thank you very much, Elias. That was another ringing presentation and so true about the nature of American democracy. Thank you very much. Okay, and I also see that despite going on for a little over 2 hours, the speeches were sufficiently inspiring, interesting, brilliant, thought-provoking that most of you have stuck around. Now we are going to try and have a very short round of questions in view of the limited time. So if I know that there are 3 hands up already, and if you wish to ask a question, please raise your hand. Let me explain what we will do. We will take all the questions that are coming. I will ask everyone to please limit themselves to only 1 minute in terms of asking a question. Be very specific about the question you ask. So we will just take all the questions. I will request all the speakers to make notes about the points to which they wish to respond. And after we've had all the questions, I will give all the speakers a chance to respond to each other, to the questions, and say any concluding things they would like to say in the same order. And while we are doing that, let me also say one other thing. I'm just putting in the chat the URL of the manifesto of the International Manifesto Group, and I hope very much that you will all consider taking a look, reading it. It's available in many languages, perhaps signing it, and perhaps also if you're interested in ideas like this, if you're interested in helping with events like this, please help us, please sign, please volunteer as well. So it's the manifesto group URL is right there. Okay, so now I will come to taking the questions. Please remember 1 minute each. And I will start with Nick Waslin. Nick, please go ahead. Are you there, Nick? Hello. Okay, Nick, if you can message me if you're having difficulties, I will solve that. I will next go to Sally Whitehead. Sally, please go ahead. Sally? Okay, let me try something else. Can you pose your question now, Sally? Okay. All right, let's go to the next one then. Keith, please go ahead. Keith Bennett. Are you there, Keith? Okay, let me, okay, there. I'm perfect, I'm here, wonderful. Thank you.
But I'm mystified because I didn't have my hand up. Or at least...
Oh, I saw your hand up, that's why.
Sorry. No.
Okay, please, if you don't want to ask a question, please lower your hand. Finally, then only one more person, and that is Mai Lim Gim Zhao. If you would like to pose a question, please go ahead.
Radhika, do you need to elevate people to participate?
I just did actually in the case of. Okay, can you? I think Mai Lim Gim Zhao is elevated, but I don't see him. Can you say your question, please?
Yes. So after, as far as we are concerned, after China underwent important change and also reform, has China already softened or already simmered down in terms of Marxism standpoint against United States on, as well as the world world as well. Yes.
Was that question clear to everyone? I'm assuming it was. Maybe could you also write it down in the chat, and I will rephrase it in a minute. I will now go to Jim Grant. Jim, please ask your question.
Hi, yeah, thanks very much to everybody for their contributions today. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. The question is, in terms of the internationalism, you know, I've heard a lot of different talks today about what's happening in different countries, and it's all really positive and very good. My concern is you know, but how do we keep this going? How do we make it international? How do these different areas all come together, so that the rest of us have something then to join, so that we're not having economic competitions even between different systems? Hope that question's all right.
Great, thank you. Jenny Blackwell, please ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I would like to ask, I'm completely kind of bowled over by this, but I must say I can cope with an hour's lecture and remember it, but 3 hours, I probably won't. But I also would like to know if we can save the transcript. Would that be put in a proper form? Can we have that to show friends, or can we buy it?
Right, absolutely, Jenny. One thing we are planning to do is, if not, what we're going to perhaps do is ask all the speakers to send us their transcripts and put them up. So we'll try and do that for sure. And this entire event will also go on the website, so you will be able to hear it again or parts of it as you please.
The problem is, I mean, I read a lot in politics, but it should be available to people. I have learned a lot, and I say that not in the proud way, but I'm politically informed because it's what I do. But there are lots of people for whom those facts are completely new, and we should have that in an accessible form.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we can all say we have all learned a lot. I'm going to take only the final two people now, and that is Ben Hay Him. Please ask your question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks a lot for all the speakers. It was really cool to hear people from all over the world talking about this. So mine, I'm going to try to keep it a brief, like two-part question. The first part being that I'm from the United States, and I'm descended from the settlers, the white settlers, and I'm wondering what people from Venezuela or Cuba or elsewhere believe that the most important thing for a leftist in the US can do. And then my second kind of part of that is my dad was listening with me, and he's very sympathetic. I don't know if he would call himself a leftist, but he's very sympathetic and he agrees on a lot of issues. But he was also saying that he hears a lot of jargon and a lot of buzzwords. And I'm wondering about how to best communicate with people who might be sympathetic to me, but but just don't hear the words and shut down.
Great, thank you. And final question from Tommy. Please go ahead, Tommy. Tommy? Tommy, can you please put your question?
So hi, I'm Tommy. I'm also from the United States, and my kind of question is about what are the panelists' thoughts on kind of the messiness of transnational solidarity? For example, Iran and Russia may not necessarily be considered to some of us as socialist democracies. And in addition, for example, when I talk about messiness, also when many global South countries at this moment kind of support, the two-state solution for Palestinian liberation after the Oslo Accords. So just wondering how folks kind of, wade through the messiness and talk about it vis-a-vis kind of socialist democracy and yeah, international solidarity.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We will now take, so that is the end of the questions, and we will now take responses, beginning once again with Danny. But before I go to Danny, I just want to draw attention to the message Carlos put in the chat, which is that our other co-organizer of this is Friends of Socialist China, and you may also all want to consider signing up for this Friends of Socialist China newsletter, and the URL is right there. Okay, so Danny, briefly, your responses to others, as well as any responses you have to any of the questions, and any closing comments.
Sure. So I'll just answer the last question that was asked because I think it's a good one. The model of a multipolar world, I think, is a very powerful one that China leads, and honestly, all of the socialist democracies that we spoke of today are in favor of, and those countries that, while maybe not having socialist democracies in their own national context, also share a common development goal, journey, and experience in relation to imperialism and the ways in which unipolar hegemony led by the United States has affected them greatly, held countries like Russia, for example, back immensely. So I think adherence to that is really the most powerful form of internationalism at this time, given that what is needed most is that countries, nations of all particular development systems have the right to self-determination and the ability to determine their own destinies while also engaging in relationships of solidarity that are beneficial to not only each individual nation, but also the entire world. So I think adherence to multipolarity, studying it, and ultimately standing with those countries who truly are practicing it and encouraging it globally is the most important thing. But I have no closing remarks other than thanking everyone for their participation, for their support of Friends of Socialist China and the International Manifesto Group, and for engaging in what is really a difficult conversation to have, especially in the United States and the Western world, to talk about socialist countries as democracies and to really get to the political and economic intricacies of different development systems at a time when there is such a hostile new Cold War being waged and led by the United States. And I just want to thank everyone for their contributions today and those who attended and watched.
Thanks very much, Danny. Next, we will go to Zershu Liu for anything Zershu thinks Professor Chang might want to add or anything. Zershu, would you like to say anything?
Yeah. I actually want to respond to the question about what the left in the United States could do. Because I do have some feelings about the situation of the left in the US. I think the first thing that people should do is to get clear, to present a very clear and specific concept of the left, what it means, because I always feel absurd that people in the United States, refer to the Democrats as the left. And then a lot of people involved in any kind of politics and have any negative opinions about the government as the left. I think the first thing is to get a clear idea about what left is, and also how the left should be related to the idea of socialism and communism too, because those words have been demonized in the Anglo-American context, that any mention of it would be categorized as anti-social or mad people, radicals, extremely radical people who do not care about the well-being of society. I think it's, the first thing to do is to present socialism in its own meaning, in relation to the emancipation of the people, the well-being of the people, the freedom, the ultimate freedom of the people. And that's what I want to say.
Okay, thank you so much, Zashu. And that was, Carlos is unfortunately had to leave early, so I'm going to now go to Luna Oy or Luna Nguyen. Luna, please go ahead.
I want to also like reply to Ben's question first about what's the most important thing for leftists in the US to do. It is a very important question, and this is the thing that I've been doing a lot, I try to answer the same question in my channel. I think that like you as looking at you, the imperial court, from the perspective of Vietnamese living in Vietnam, the first thing you need to do is educate yourself, like from according to your ability to according to your need. If you can, educate yourself, read more, and maybe listen to more from people like people of color like me, and like try to spend more time listening to people outside of the imperial core. And the second thing is that like if you can, maybe organize in your local areas, try to do some like actual works out there, such as like join like food not bombs, and the food bank, and try to help people in your area. The point is that like you need to make the people in your living areas to know about you first, and then whenever they have any difficulties, you are going to be the first people that they think about and call for help. This is to build like next to build dual power structure to help those people. That is when like we can. This comes from the actual experience of Vietnam when we had our first revolution in 1945. Ho Chi Minh got the support from millions of Vietnamese people in 1945. Even though 90% of Vietnamese people at the time didn't even know how to read or write. We didn't even know what communism meant at that time, but he still got the support for millions of Vietnamese just because right before the revolution, the communists in Vietnam, we stole the rice from the Japanese storage houses, and we distributed rice to hungry people. So like, go and support and try to deal with the actual material needs of the people in your area is very important. The second question is about how to communicate to sympathetic people, the people who like, still like don't like communism, but sympathetic, I think the best thing to do is to show them the true nature of the USA, just tell them like, what did the USA did to indigenous people, and then what USA did to Cuba, to Vietnamese, to other countries like that. Like, just ask them like, do they deserve to be treated like that? So like, just go from the simple small thing like that, and time after time, I hope that you can leverage your communication with those people. So then that's it. Again, like I am a dialectical materialist, so you must come from the material base before you have any higher education on people.
Thank you so much, Luna. Next is Kiul Chang. Please go ahead, Kiul.
First, I like to remind and highlight the talk from Mr. Park, the second, we called Korean American generation, born in the United States. Made such a powerful, informative, and educational speech. And as a first generation, I'm coming from, by the way, one of the questions raised right after my talk on the chatting room with where I'm coming from South Korea or the North Korea. I'm from the geographically from South Korea. But there is no two Koreas. There's only one Korea. We are talking about the tens of thousands of years that has been divided by the outside forces quote unquote imperialist, the strategic intention to divide us last 76 years. But back to the point I was talking about, the picture, the typical stereotypical image of the DPRK, Cuba, Venezuela, China, Russia, any anti-imperialist, any independent, self-determined nation or not have been unimaginably demonized the day and night by the US and Western so-called corporate media, the mainstream media, including the Japanese and the South Korean, the pro-US and pro-Japanese, the corporate media, in unison, day and night, pumping out the demonized, the manufactured image of such as the society, the DPRK, as the brother, the Mr. Park said, I hope every one of you or everyone who listens to this, the occasion, encourage you to visit the northern part of Korea, the DPRK, and you go there to see what kind of society, what kind of socialist democracy has been flourishing last over 70 some years under unbelievable non-stop sanctions and non-stop the nuclear war threats, but that nation not only had survived, but also, according to the Dr. Jeffrey Lewis from US mainstream, the scholar, the game is over and the North Korea has won. I hope, I'd like to encourage you to go there to see what the real picture of that over 70-year-long non-stop demonized society is all about. So again, I am deeply, deeply appreciative to young, still late 20s, young gentleman, the Park. His speech was amazingly well done. So again, that's my comment. Again, I'm coming from South, but I'm going back and forth, but I'm not allowed to return to South Korea for over 22 years, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah, another example of the great democratic character of some of the regimes that President Biden is hosting. Now, next speaker is Roland Boer. Roland, please go ahead.
A couple of brief comments. The first one, when we're talking about democracy, perhaps there's two levels among many that we need to consider. One is internal to a country. The other one is between countries. And, the principle of no matter how large or small, each one has an equal voice applies internationally to each country. And in the current reality of the long-term coexistence of capitalist countries and socialist countries, this is a reality. So to try and divide the world into so-called democracies and non-democracies or authoritarian is actually thoroughly undemocratic at an international level. Mm-hmm. And the second one, this is more of a suggestion, is that ultimately, socialist democracy itself is not an end, but a means. And it's a means to what Marx and Engels called a society in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. That's all. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Roland. Isabel, it's your turn. Please go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
No, I've heard with much interest the question and the last intervention of the colleagues, and there is only one point that it seems to me that has been expressed, and I want to underline the importance, that is the role of consciousness and what Gramsci called collective will. Yes, we are Marxist, and therefore for us it's very clear the role of material forces in society, economic forces, etc. This is the point of departure. But it is very clear that it was essential for Marx and Engels And so also for the great Marxists that came afterward, Lenin, Gramsci, Rosa, Fidel, etc., Mariatti in the case, Ho Chi Minh, of course, is that the formation of consciousness. If all these needs, is all this problem, is this claim the need for changes, do not get into the head of the people in a clear way so they understand the world. Marx didn't say do not understand the world, only practice. No, you need to understand the world so the practice is based in a right understanding of the world. That is a theory, a comprehension of not only of your country, but what is going on in the whole world. And then that has to go through the head of the people. And the people, when the new thought, new understanding, they can really then direct their will and fight. People has to fight. People have been always fighting, but we have to stress that this is essential. Democracy is a process. Democracy is never ending. The fight for democracy is never ending. New changes have to come into democracy as the history goes forward. New things are coming up, new needs, new wantings, and then democracy have to move in that sense too. And if you have, for the real development of democracy, you need a clear culture consciousness citizen is essential. The participation of synthesis. I remember Marx in the first volume of Capital underlying the importance of ethics and politics in as a second factor, which he called Haupt, that is main, to differentiate it from fundamental. And then the colleagues that demand, what can the United States do but fight against imperialism together with the whole world that is fighting against imperialism? Democracy, real democracy that goes beyond liberal democracy is not possible with imperialism intervening and creating wars and oppressing people of their own country and other countries. This is, I think this is important to have in mind also for democracy. Thank you
so much, Isabel. Thank you very much for your very important interventions. Next is Chu Han Park. Please go ahead, Chu Han.
Thank you so much. I don't have any closing comments today. I think that everyone else has done a pretty spectacular job of wrapping this up. I do want to plug Norutol and let everyone know where you can find us. We're on social media at Norutol, that's NODUTDOL. You can also visit our website at norutol.org. As a personal note, I would like to extend a very warm thank you to Chang Kyosunim for his very kind words. Dr. Chang was very supportive and generous with his time leading up to this, and really with his entire life, which he has dedicated to the cause of Korean liberation. If he seems very excited, it's because I think what Norutol is doing today would not be possible without a previous generation of folks like him who have sacrificed a lot and done a lot to make the higher consciousness of a new generation possible. So, 감사합니다. Thank you to everyone. And I'll pass on to the next speaker.
Thanks so much. And the next speaker is Jai Go Chang. Please go ahead.
I think he left earlier because
there
he
you
said it's midnight and he had a
okay. So he's not here. In that case, we will go to Leila Brown Vincent. Leila.
I think the only comment that hadn't been, only question that hadn't directly been addressed was the question about accessibility. And my comment to that is just really brief. I think that the problem with jargon, I think sometimes, is that we're talking about very specific phenomena. And so we do have to be, I think, particular and discerning about language. That doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be convoluted and difficult, but it also does mean that we have to engage in process in making ourselves familiar with things. I think things become more accessible as they become more familiar. And so the only thing that I would be like could in a concrete sense offer is to engage in forums like this. And when I say read, I mean reading things that are accessible, or even listening, right? Listening to these conversations that then introduce certain vocabulary into our, into our lexicon, and then that we have to do some work to discover those things. But the biggest thing I think is that these are not individual processes, and that it's work that we have to do in community. And so we have to find other people to do this with, to talk these things out with, to ask questions, to seek clarity. None of us are coming up with the answers on our own, and we can only do that in community. So that's the only response that I think I have to that. And I just want to say thank you again for the invitation to participate.
Thanks, Leila. And finally, Elias, you get the final word. Elias, are you here? Maybe I think he had to go as well. Well, in that case, we will bring this meeting to an end. I would like to do that by once again thanking all the panelists. As you can see from the chat, and as I think various people have said, they feel very informed. And I would say that I think we can all say to each other that, I mean, I feel very informed as well by so many of the speeches. I think it's been wonderful. I think we should continue this. I hope that we will all come together in one or the other format in the future, again, to discuss these very important themes, to forward these ideas, and to make the world a more just place, a more inclusive place, a more equal place above all. And this is what's really missing. And I think it's discussions like this, and above all, of course, the struggles that we are talking about that make them so. So on behalf of Friends of Socialist China and of the International Manifesto Group, let me end this. Let me also end by saying, please do visit our websites, internationalmanifesto.org, friendsofsocialistchina.org. Consider signing up, volunteering, etc. I think it's a huge collective enterprise, and we welcome your input, your participation, etc. So with that, let me thank you all. Thanks to all the audience for coming and for sticking around for such a long time, and for your interest. Okay. And I should say that this is our last event for this year. But of course, please watch out for our notices in the early part of the new year. We have planned a whole series of very exciting seminars and webinars in the coming year. So Happy New Year to everybody. Happy holidays. Bye-bye.